Okay, this is the Beelink EQR6 6900HX, and it's got 24 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM and a 1 terabyte SSD inside. It's very similar to the Beelink CER6 6900HX, except this is probably the much more watered down kind of version of it. This has fewer ports, much simpler. The front port here, not USB 4, does have the front audio jack, but no rear audio jack, no USB 4. It's got dual gigabit Ethernet. It does have a built-in power supply. I think that's kind of useful, and just a few USB ports, USB-A ports. And this is very bare bones, essential kind of I/O. You don't get USB 4, you don't get Oculink, you don't get HDMI 2.1. This maxes out to two 4K 60Hz displays. So, yeah. No fancy metal case. It is plastic. The plastic feels good. It's nice, but it does scratch easily. I don't know if you can see this, but I've already kind of dinged it a little bit. Just leaving it flat on this mat. I must have moved it at some point and scratched it somewhere. So just keep that in mind. This is not exactly the highest quality mini PC, but it is still a mini PC nonetheless with a powerful 6900HX processor. And that built-in power supply is maybe doing some work or interest for some people that really want that. So that way you don't have a side brick or something that's getting in the way of your projects. Not exactly much of an issue for Beelink because they're using a lot of these GAN type power supplies, and these are just like smaller kind of boxes that plug into the wall. It really doesn't take up too much space. So going with this, it's appealing to a very small niche of people, typically wanting their computers for very, very light use. And yeah, we're going to go ahead and try and open this up, and while I just talk about and the machine. I'll post some specs, a Google Sheet with performance numbers, and we'll just cover some of the basics about this machine. Performance overall is not great. I'll give it that. It is somewhat decent still for a very newish processor. This is a Zen 3 Plus 6900HX, so 16-thread processor with a relatively very powerful 680M iGPU. That's all great on paper, but the actual computer inside is power and temperature limited. So whereas the normal Beelink CER6 6900HX would be at a 54 watt TDP and a 90 degrees Celsius thermal throttling limit, the EQR6 has that turned down to 35 watts. And that's a considerable power decrease and a max temperature of about 85 degrees Celsius. And we can see the reason why they had to do that is this built-in power supply. This is adorable. This is a really cool and compact power supply. It is tiny. It doesn't even go all the way down to the base over here. It's just a small section power supply that Beelink somehow found the space to cram it inside this machine. This is about the same size as a CER6 6900HX, and it's not easy fitting more stuff in there. Of course, they did save space by removing the secondary fan and relying more on the main fan, which isn't bigger, or it might even arguably be smaller than, because once we start opening this computer, the fan's over here blowing air out through these two main vents, and this half of this third vent over here is pure aesthetics. It actually leads to this power supply, so there's no airflow going out of there. And this is one of those really weird computers where it's really quiet, and it's honestly one of the easiest things that I've opened up and just used out of the box just for web browsing and watching videos. But the moment I try to open up games or try to run anything particularly demanding, it's pretty apparent that this computer underperforms compared to the CER6. And that's okay. It's got a healthy amount of, well, let's not take apart that power supply just yet. It's got a healthy amount of RAM. 24 gigabytes is pretty good. DDR5 5600 megahertz, that's great. And for a Surface 6, it just won't run at the 5600 megahertz speed, but it'll be limited to 4800 megahertz. Beelink just keeps mass producing these 5600 megahertz DIMMs and just using them everywhere. I don't have an issue with that. If you get a faster computer and it just happens to have 4800 megahertz RAM, swap it out. And it'll give your new computer a speed boost, and this one will still run the same. And 24 gigabytes is a good amount of RAM, in my opinion. Is just that when I use a lot of, and I do mean a lot of very demanding software, it can be apparent to me that I'm getting really close to 16 gigabytes of RAM. I very rarely exceed 16 gigabytes, especially if I'm not doing anything particularly demanding, because this thing is limited to its 85 watt power supply. This 6900HX will sporadically shut down. If you crank that up to crank the power limit to 54 watts, it will use more than 85 watts of power that this power supply can supply, and the computer will shut down as a result. I'm just removing the front I/O here. It is maybe perhaps possible 45 watts will be stable, but it is definitely pushing the computer to its limits. The second NVMe slot here is pretty interesting because Beelink includes 2 NVMe slots. I think that's good. Most mini PCs should have at least 2 storage drives, so you can put in your new one and then an old drive. That's good. The second drive is really weird because they've located it on top of this heatsink. And you can unscrew these 2 screws and they have access. Oh, almost. You get one more screw over here. So 3 screws, and you can open up this little drive cover. It's got a little bit of thermal pad to at least cover the controller. It's cost saving. They could have put thermal pad all along here so that way the rest of this would act as a heatsink. And that would be sufficient for another PCIe. I think this is a second Gen 4 drive slot. And you also have this little standoff here where you can screw in and hold down your 2280 drive. Doesn't hold any particular other size, but yeah, 2280 is the most common and typically the most cost effective. So next I'm going to go ahead and remove the complete cover, and you can see the main drive here. All right, 3 screws there, 2 screws here. Give it a little shimmy. There's a thermal pad underneath. Oh, I'm going to go ahead and unscrew this. I don't necessarily need to do this, but it's just going to be safer for me. Since these ribbon cables are very delicate, you really don't want to play too many games if you can. Because if you're opening and closing this computer one too many times or too recklessly, you can easily tear these ribbon cables, so try and be very delicate. All right, just reaching in with my nail underneath. Pop that open. You can use a little plastic tool or knife, and you can see here, this is the secondary heatsink for the other NVMe drive. Beelink just simply did not have the space to put another drive to the side here while still fitting in the power supply, so they put it directly on top. This cable is going to cause issues if anybody's connecting an eGPU. You'll want to connect an eGPU M.2 here and move this main drive over here, because the bottleneck from this ribbon cable is just going to flat out just interfere too much. So always just keep your parts together. I'm not adding a second drive here. One, two, three. Keep that all together so that you can reassemble it. And yeah, this is a Gen 4 drive. It's one of the AZW brand types of drives. If I remember right, it uses a M4 type socket to unscrew it. And when you're screwing this back together, be sure to go a little bit slow. Use a hand screwdriver. Disassembly with an electric screwdriver is fine. Just be a little bit more delicate if you're going to do this by tightening it. Just grab ourselves a tweezer. Grab that standoff, mini standoff over here. Ooh, okay. There we go. Not a lot of people are going to have the socket to remove one of these hex standoffs. So if you need to, get yourself a kind of just generic screw kit. You just want something with a lot of bits, like 120 or something. And these kits are sold pretty cheap for around like $20 or something. Gives you all the bits that you could possibly need for most computer disassemblies. Handy for smartphones as well. I'm going to disconnect the drive. You can take a quick look here. This is a P3 Plus. It's not a crucial P3 Plus. It's an AZW P3 Plus. It has very similar performance. No DRAM, no TLC, but it's the basics, and it's 1 terabyte. It's a handy drive to have. And you can hold a lot of video storage and data using that. All right, and then here we can take a look. This is Crucial branded. DDR5 5600 megahertz, 1.1 volt, CL16. Yeah, 12 gigabytes. This is the first time that I've seen 12 gigabytes of RAM being used on a mini PC. I think it's a good choice. It's a very good cost-saving measure, but double check that you're actually saving money when you're buying one of these computers with 24 gigabytes RAM, that it is actually cheaper than the alternatives with 32 gigabytes. There's nothing really bad getting more RAM. It might be a little bit warmer, but pretty negligible downsides other than cost. All right. And here we have the wireless card. It is hot glued in there, which is nasty business. I don't like removing hot glue. I thought Beelink was beyond this, but apparently not. And I am not eager to get into the mess of accidentally tearing an antenna here. If you do absolutely need to remove the drive, a little bit of heat will go a long way. But for now, I'm just going to hang the wireless card right out. That's reasonably safe. And next, to remove this main board, because I've already done all of this so that you can reach the SSD, the M.2 cards, and all the RAM. How many screws did we go through? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 plus 6. Yeah, about 17 screws. Oh boy. So this disassembly is not as bad as the GTi14 Ultra, but it's not exactly going to win any awards for being reasonably easy to do. It's doable. It is. But I like it when many PCs have far fewer screws to disassemble. I'm going to take out the power supply here just because I think that would be very fun to do, and I do absolutely need to do that to remove the main board. This power supply sits directly on top of the main board, and it's in the way. I can gently pry off this cap. I'm going to have a better look at the specs. Just 85 watts. That's not a lot, but it is compatible with 110 and 240 volts. So if you are in a different country and plug this in, it should hypothetically work. This is a custom Beelink power supply. It's got thermal pads. It is doing everything in its power to radiate heat inside of the case. And that extra heat is kind of a downside for performance. Okay. So, keeping a mini PC more compact by having an external power supply is a good idea. Especially since the power supplies externally are relatively compact these days, if you get your hands on a GAN power supply. If you do not, it can be a little bit of an issue finding an adapter, but more and more PCs are becoming USB-C PD power capable. So not exactly the most biggest downside. Alrighty, so enjoy. The power supply has quite a few screws. If you are like just diving right into one of these disassemblies, to the best of your ability, I really recommend giving the computer just a quick moment after disconnecting power. Hold the power button. Make sure all the capacitors empty of power before starting to disassemble. You don't want to accidentally shock yourself while doing this. All right, thermal pad can stay. So 1, 2, 3, 4 screws that are holding the power supply in. Those can be removed. And then this power supply connector can just be gently pulled out of here. And we can take a closer look at how this power supply is made. It is custom, so this is a issue for replacements. I don't want to give anybody the impression like, oh, this will be super easy to replace like an external power supply. Most power supplies on many PCs are using, oh, this cover isn't coming out, so that's going to stay. But most mini PCs are using a 5.5. Oh, it does come out. Hey, look at that. All right, use a 5.5 by 2.5 millimeter barrel jack. All right, this is a kind of PS2 kind of connector that you see more often on TVs or simple devices. These are nice because you can plug it in one way, flip it over, and plug it in again. They look like these. The EQR6 actually came with a gray one cable, so I was like, oh, hey, look at that. They're color matching. That's cute. But yeah, they're trying everything that they can to radiate heat away from this small power supply. And it's not much power. And it's not like you can fit much into such a small and narrow kind of little box. Go ahead and disassemble that real quick. Keep in mind where all the thermal pads are, and you can see the transformer and the capacitors. Everything looks in pretty decent condition. This is just a really compact power supply. Looks relatively decent. I haven't noticed anything particularly strange with power other than if you put too much power or rely on the limit and go up to like 54 watts, the computer does shut down sporadically. And you can experiment higher than the standard 35 watt limit. Just don't get your hopes high that this is a high performance gaming little mini PC. It's really not intended to be that. It's supposed to be like you open it right out of the box. Everything works. Noise is not an issue. You're not hopping into Windows power management and turning off boost controls. And you're not going into the BIOS immediately to turn down settings to reduce noise. All right, keep track of the standoffs. What's our time? 18:49. Okay. A couple more minutes and then we'll get all the way in. Temperatures are reasonable. I mean, I am reasonably confident this machine's not going to harm itself at all with the very lazy temperature limit of 85°C. The 6900HX can safely get to about 100 degrees Celsius with spikes, and it just doesn't go there. Okay. Oh, before I get any further, there are 2 screws. I did remove 2 standoffs here that were holding it down, but I do need to remove those screws because I'm flexing the case a little bit. PH0 screw bit here. Seems like a PH0 can get you by most of this disassembly process. That feels much better. And just need to flex the front a little bit to get the Ethernet ports out, and then pull the whole system out. Oh, good grief. It's real stuck in there. There we go. I am flexing the back of the case a little bit to get me some leverage, and I'm putting my fingers underneath to help push the remaining bit out. And there you go. Main board is out, and we can see that Beelink really saved a lot of space here to fit that power supply in. They just took out an entire quarter of the main board. We have a very similar fan to the Beelink EQR6 6900HX. And, well, the power supply, those heat fans that were on the other side that were blocking the power supply, are just there for aesthetics. And it's really just there to even out the ports on the rear to make it look a little bit larger, like you're getting something special. And you're not really. Underneath, there's only 2 heat pipes. No vapor chamber, and it's pretty similar to the Beelink EQR6. So the CPU cooling is great. Like, it's the same thing that I'm already familiar with. Disconnect the fan connector, 1, 2, 3 screws, and this will come off, and then there's 4 more screws underneath holding the actual heatsink down. And you just unscrew that, and you can repaste this thing. I don't believe there is any liquid metal underneath, but you can look at and kind of enjoy that. Beelink's board design is pretty good. Like, capacitors and SMD components are pretty even. I don't see any open or missing pads, which is nice. And yeah, aside from these maybe flimsy ribbon cables, they are clean and organized method of getting the boards together. It makes the assembly, I argue, perhaps a little bit easier to have the smaller board broken up into 2 pieces, because I can take out that small front I/O section first, and that gives me all the space I need to nudge this board backwards out of the rear I/O and come back out. There is another way of actually doing that, and ASRock did that pretty well, where the rear of their case was detachable, and that allowed them to really keep their main board more as a single piece, a little bit longer in the front, because you can unscrew the case's rear, and then the rest of the main board could come out. Just food for thought for Beelink, but this is functional. You can disassemble it. It's a bit of work, but you can get to the good fun part that you want, and then you can take a look. Oh, hey, here's the antenna pads. These could be larger. These really could. Here are some aftermarket antenna pads. You can see they're like 2 or 3 times the size of these, and you can buy these and make them larger. I didn't particularly have any wireless issues with their let's see, an AX200 Wi-Fi 6E Intel wireless card. I am glad that Beelink is consistently using Intel wireless cards. I do prefer them over the Realtek kind of wireless cards. But yeah, if it works, it works. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, reasonable. Nothing super long range, but functional, I guess. And yeah, that's all there really is to the case. I can go ahead and reassemble it, but this has been a relatively quicker disassembly of the Beelink EQR6. I wish you all a wonderful day. Yeah, catch you next time.